Now, one of the most controversial statements of the book of Romans, or at least one of the most difficult statements to understand, comes in Romans chapter 11, verse 26, where we read, "And in this way all Israel will be saved." What does Israel mean? Does it refer to an ethnic mass conversion of Jews at the end, or does it simply mean that all the elect will be saved? These are the two main views that are out there. Now, this is, in some sense, a follow-up video to a video I made about the church being true Israel, and so I won't go over the arguments for that again, but you can go back to my channel and look for that particular video. So I'm not considering any sense in which we could say that all Israel will be saved is referring to, the in some way the nation of Israel being established in the 20th century. So I'm excluding that from our consideration here. The main question I'm asking in this video is whether or not Romans chapter 11 verse 26, when it says, "And in this way all Israel will be saved," whether or not that actually refers to a mass conversion of ethnic Jews, or whether it refers merely to the ingathering of the elect as it happens throughout the entire age of the church. So that is that particular question. And as we think about this question, the first thing that we need to think about is the context, and particularly the context of all of Romans chapters 9 to 11. And the reason this is important is because Romans chapter 11 verse 26 is part of Paul's conclusion to a question that was begun in chapters 9 to 11. And it's important to note that this actually was related to ethnic Israel. The question that was being posed to the Apostle Paul implicitly, or the one that he's answering in his letter, is whether or not God's promises have failed, given so many ethnic Jews, ethnic Israel you could say, has rejected the gospel. If they're able to reject the gospel, does this mean that God's promises have failed? And there's all kinds of different answers that Paul has given to this, or you could say elements to the answer to this question. He begins by distinguishing that not all of Israel are Israel. So there is, in fact, a spiritual component, an invisible component to Israel that is related to election. And this remnant, you could say, is a part of true Israel in the sense that they are the ones that actually do receive the promises. So there is this distinction that Paul makes in chapter 9 between the outward Israel and, you could say, spiritual, invisible Israel that's related to election. And then Paul then goes on to speak further about the rejection of the Jews. So, they were the ones that have rejected. They're not a part of true Israel, you could say. And the reason why that is evident is because they have not submitted to the righteousness of God as it's been revealed in the gospel, but they've sought to establish their own righteousness. And Paul says in chapter 10 that he really does wish that they would be saved. He says that they really are zealous for God, but they are not zealous for God in a way that's in accordance with knowledge. Paul then says that this method of salvation and this righteousness that is by faith and by grace, that it actually was taught in the Old Testament itself, quoting from Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 30. He says, this is the righteousness of the gospel, and that is the thing that the Jews have rejected. Furthermore, he even says that they don't really have an excuse for this because the message has actually gone out to the end of the earth. That the proclamation of the gospel has gone to them, and so they've received this message, but they have rejected it. And importantly, then at the end of Romans chapter 10, Paul then will say that this ethnic Jewish rejection of the gospel, so far from being a problem for the fulfillment of prophecy and the fulfillment of God's promises, Paul actually says that it was predicted in the Old Testament itself. So quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 21, he says this, "I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry." I will make you jealous, the point that Paul is saying, because I will give them grace and it will be withheld from you. Paul then quotes from Isaiah, who says the same thing. "I have been found by those who did not seek me, that is, by the Gentiles. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me." And the contrast there, particularly in Isaiah chapter 65, is in fact between those who appear to be near, who are rejected, and those who are far off, who are received. And the point that Paul's making is, look, it has always been predicted even that there would be a rejection of the gospel by the Jews at some point and an ingathering of the nations on the other hand. But then Paul says at the beginning of Romans 11 that this is not total. We should not think that all of ethnic Israel has rejected the gospel. Paul gives himself as an example. Consider me. I am a true Jew. I am from the tribe of Benjamin. And then he says there will always be a remnant according to the election of grace. And so to this point, then, we could say that Paul's given a number of different elements to this answer of what about Israel and their rejection of the gospel. All of it, you'll note, has had to do with ethnic Israel, and all of it is related particularly to what is happening in Paul's own time. So he says, not all who are ethnically Israel are actually a part of true Israel. So there are promises that are made to true Israel that do not apply to ethnic Israel. He says that the method of salvation that is proclaimed in the gospel by the apostles is that which is found in the Old Testaments. That's what the Jews have rejected. This was even predicted that they would reject it, but the rejection has not been total. There is a remnant according to the election of grace. Now, all of this is a part of Paul's answer. But then in Romans chapter 11, verses 10 and following, there is a shift where Paul moves from speaking about the rejection of the Jews in his own day to what will happen closer to the end. And now he's answering kind of a related or a correlative question, which is, will this rejection last forever? And in this context, he says, that they did not actually stumble so as to fall completely. Rather, their trespass means salvation to the Gentiles. So they've not stumbled so as to completely fall. Their stumbling now, in some sense, has meant the rejection, the salvation for the Gentiles. And then he says, in the context of this, if such is the case in their rejection, what will their full inclusion mean? So here Paul is holding out this idea that the Gentiles have received a great salvation through their rejection, but he's saying there may be a full inclusion. He's even kind of presupposing that this will take place. This is at least opening the door for a mass conversion that will happen at the end. You'll note here too that in Romans chapter 11 verse 12 that Paul is without question, when he says their inclusion, he is without question referring to ethnic Jews, because they are the ones that had just stumbled, and now they're going to be included. Then we get later, Paul will say the same thing, the very next paragraph there. He says, for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? This, again, seems to be holding out the possibility and the hope of a future conversion, which was assumed in verse 12, and now here is stated again. And it seems to be even this is going to be even come in the context of the resurrection from the dead. Their acceptance will be life from the dead, that is to say, the resurrection from the dead at the end. Paul is speaking about what will happen again in the future. From there, Paul then will give a metaphor of the rejection of Israel and its relationship to an olive tree. So here there is the branches that have been broken off, that is the Jews, the ethnic Jews have been broken off from their olive tree. Then the Gentiles are grafted in. We are not to boast over those branches that have been broken off, because we will be broken off as well if we do not continue in the faith. And then he also says, though, that God in fact may and is able to, God is able to graft the Jews back into their own olive tree. He says, look, you've been grafted in, even though you weren't by nature a part of the olive tree. How much more reasonable is it to think that God will engraft again those branches that are by nature a part of the olive tree? This again seems to be holding out this future mass conversion of Israel, whereby they will go from being characterized by rejection, not a total rejection in Paul's day, as clearly there's a remnant, but they are still characterized by a rejection in Paul's day. But there will be a day when they will be characterized by an acceptance, which will mean that they will not be characterized by having been broken off from their olive branch, from their olive tree, but rather being regrafted into it. And then we get the paragraph that is where the passage that we're considering comes from. In this way, all Israel will be saved, which we'll come back to. But then finally, after that, the way in which the passage concludes is with Paul in Romans 11 saying, towards the end here, that the Jews are enemies as regards the gospel, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. That is to say, they are currently enemies. They've generally rejected, but there is coming a time when they will be beloved, and that's because of their forefathers. It's because of election. And so Paul will say in verses 31 and 32, so they too have now become disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Now, there could be a potential problem with the word now in the text. when Paul says, in order that by mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. You could say, well, this seems to be them receiving mercy now. It's a little bit difficult in terms of the context insofar as Paul has been speaking about the way in which they are not receiving mercy now. But two, there's actually a good reason to think that the word now is actually not a part of the original text. It's not a part of P46, which is a very early papyrus manuscript. It's not a part of Alexandrinus, again, a very early manuscript. It's not a part of the Byzantine reading as well. So this kind of, what's considered the majority text view, it's not a part of any of those readings. And if it's not there, then very clearly what Paul is saying is that there's coming a future time when they will receive the mercy of God. Now, all of this is significant for our understanding of Romans chapter 11, verse 26, where Paul speaks of all Israel being saved. In this way, all Israel will be saved. You'll notice here in the context of what Paul is saying, in verse 25, he speaks of a partial hardening that has come over Israel. But then until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and then it says, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the Redeemer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob. That is the text as is before us. But you'll note here, very clearly, you would think on the basis of the context that when Paul speaks of Israel, he would be referring to ethnic Israel. Furthermore, that he is speaking about a future conversion of Israel also makes sense from the context, because he has actually said the same thing in the passage 4 different times. That is to say, when you take a step back and you say, how is Paul answering the question of what we are to think about the rejection of ethnic Israel? He's giving really 2 answers. He's saying in chapter 9, verse 1, all the way to chapter 11, verse 9, that there is in fact a remnant that's chosen according to the election of grace. But then from verse 10 on to the end of the chapter, he is saying that there will be a time when they will receive the gospel. There is a time when there will actually be an acceptance. Now, all this would be to say that the prima facie, surface level reading of Romans 11, verse 26, and in this way all Israel will be saved, would lead us to the conclusion that Paul is speaking about a mass conversion of Israel, ethnic Jews, immediately preceding the return of the Lord Jesus Christ, his second coming. Now, those who take the other view will often point out that the word in this way in the original, which is hutos, cannot mean and then. So the idea is verse 25 is speaking of a partial hardening that has come upon the Jews until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then we read, and in this way all Israel will be saved. They say, and in this way, that word hutos cannot mean and then, as in like the next thing. That is to say that the grammar does not allow for the conclusion that there will be a partial hardening of the Jews, the Gentiles will come in, and then the next thing that will happen is that the Jews will be saved. So they'll say that the word hutos cannot mean this. And this is in fact true. The word hutos does not mean that in the original, and it should not be made to mean that here. However, there is something else that is missed with regard to this word. Those who are interpreting the text in this way, where they'll say that in this way is referring to what came immediately preceding. That is to say, all Israel will be saved in the sense that all the Gentiles will come in the context of there being a partial hardening of the Jews. The problem with that interpretation is that they're reading the hutos, the word in this way, as referring to what precedes, when actually it is clear that the word hutos in the context must refer to what follows. And this is because the text reads, and in this way all Israel will be saved, but it doesn't end there. And it says next, as it is written, the Redeemer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, quoting from Isaiah chapter 59. The reason this is significant is because the word as there is kathos in the original. So you have hutos, something, and then kathos, something. These 2 clauses must be interpreted together because hutos and kathos are correlative conjunctions. The idea would be something like both and. If you see both and, you wouldn't want to interpret the both clause apart from the and clause. You wouldn't interpret the both something and something as if the both were disconnected from the and. Both and are meant to be read together. Well, in the same way, hutos and kathos are meant to be read together. That is to say, if you were to say, in this way all Israel will be saved, what is the in this way referring to? It's referring to what follows. You could translate it this way, just to bring out this force. And in this way all Israel will be saved, namely, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, the Redeemer will come from Zion and will banish ungodliness from Jacob. That is to say, the in this way is not connected with what precedes. It's not saying that Israel will be saved by the Gentiles coming in and a partial hardening happening for the Jews. It is saying that all Israel will be saved just as it was predicted by the prophet Isaiah. Which means then that verse 26 actually is following chronologically after verse 25. The idea is that there will be a partial hardening of the Jews and until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And then the next thing that will happen is Israel will be saved, just as it is written by Isaiah the prophet. The Redeemer will come from Zion and will banish ungodliness from Jacob. There will be a future fulfillment of the promise for ethnic Israel in accordance with what the prophets have taught. That is the plain reading of the text. The word "and" itself in Greek, and particularly in Hebrew as well, which is, you got to think Paul is thinking in Hebrew ways, can have the idea of being the next thing that happens. So "and" is where you get the temporal idea of the next thing. So there will be a partial hardening of the Jews of Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Then all Israel will be saved in this way, namely as it is written. The benefit of this interpretation is, one, it interprets the correlative conjunctions as correlative conjunctions, hutos and kathos, which is the normal way that correlatives ought to be interpreted. Two, it makes sense of the context where you have ethnic Israel being in view in the entire context, beginning in Romans chapter 11, verse 10, all the way to the end of the chapter. And three, it fits the context of Paul's basic meaning, wherein he has said several times that in fact there will be a mass conversion of Jews on the last day or immediately before the last day. What we could say then is that all Israel will be saved does in fact refer to a glorious day before the return of Christ when many of the ethnic Jews will be saved, such that we could say that just as we could say now there is a general rejection of the gospel, so too we will be able to say that there will be a general reception of the gospel. All of this according to the inscrutable majesty of God's will, who has consigned all over to disobedience that he might have mercy on all.